Okay, so Rural Housing Association, which is based in Omagh in Northern Ireland, was established in 1992 to specifically address the rural housing crisis in Northern Ireland at that time and to increase the number of social housing properties that were available in some of our most disadvantaged rural communities in Northern Ireland. So as a housing association focused on the provision of housing in rural communities, we only work in areas where the population is under 5,000. So that's what we would define as rural. And we're the only housing association in Northern Ireland that solely focuses on the provision of social housing in rural areas across the entire geographical spread of Northern Ireland. However, our role as a social housing provider extends very much beyond bricks and mortar. So we play a very proactive role in helping our service users sustain their tenancy. We also provide a range of platforms through which our service users can influence decision-making within our organisation, particularly through our tenant participation work. And we work very closely with rural communities to deliver a range of community engagement initiatives aimed at creating more connected and resilient communities. So to give you some context into the demographics of Northern Ireland, approximately 37% of our population live in what's defined as a rural community. So that's well over a third of our entire population. And if we look at things like the average house prices in rural communities, it's actually more expensive than in urban areas, making it harder for rural residents, particularly those from low-income households, to get their foot on the property ladder or access affordable rents. So it's inevitable that some people living in rural communities will be impacted by issues such as rural homelessness. So rural homelessness in Northern Ireland is caused by the same issues that affect those in urban areas. So it's about the unaffordability of housing. It's about people that are struggling financially, those that have been impacted by life crisis, such as addiction, mental health issues, relationship breakdowns, etc. But for those people that live in rural areas, it's much harder for them to access sources of support, whether that be mental health support, addiction support charities, or temporary accommodation. And if we fail to address these issues in rural communities, then homelessness will continue to impact rural residents without those necessary support mechanisms in place. So within Northern Ireland, rural homelessness can often be hidden. So very rarely would you find people in rural communities sleeping outside or on the street, which is much more prevalent in urban centres. Whilst it's not as visible as homelessness in urban areas, it's still a problem that affects people in rural communities. But because it's often hidden, it makes it much more difficult to address. And in many rural communities, there's a perception that it just isn't a problem. So what we find is that many of our residents who have previously registered as homeless before moving into one of our homes, they've either been living with friends or family members or couch surfing, or living in very poor, uninhabitable conditions, or they may have had to move away from the area where they're from to access temporary accommodation. Also, there's the issue that people feel there is a stigma attached to being labelled homeless, especially in small rural communities where everybody knows everybody. And that makes it harder for people to ask for help. What we find is that some people that live in rural communities who are homeless, they're either afraid to ask for help or they feel that there's a stigma attached to registering as homeless. So as a housing association, we try to spend a lot of time engaging with rural communities to try and address that hidden homelessness and encourage people to ask for help and register for housing. So what happens if you find yourself homeless in Northern Ireland? So when someone presents as homeless, often their first point of contact will be the housing executive. And they are the government body that have the statutory duty to source temporary accommodation for those that register as homeless. And in most cases, it would be unlikely that at that point, an immediate permanent housing solution, like a social housing property, would be available. So usually a temporary accommodation option would be sourced first, and that would include the likes of housing executive hostels, voluntary sector hostels, short-term emergency lets, or short-term bed and breakfast. However, if we look at these temporary accommodation solutions, the majority of them are located in larger towns and urban centres. So therefore, for people that are from rural communities that find themselves homeless, often they have to leave a rural community where they are from and where they want to remain to access emergency accommodation. And again, this further compounds the myth that homelessness is an urban issue, when in fact, those in rural communities often have to relocate to the larger urban centres to access emergency accommodation. So once someone has presented as homeless and have received temporary accommodation from the housing executive, they will be placed on the Northern Ireland Housing Executive waiting list for social housing. And it's a points-based system to determine priority need for housing. So this housing waiting list is used to allocate all social housing properties, either from the housing executive's own stock or through housing associations like ourselves. And they provide a much longer term and more secure form of housing for those that have been presenting as homeless. However, when it comes to addressing rural homelessness, the housing waiting list doesn't always accurately reflect the number of homeless or those in housing need in rural areas, particularly smaller rural communities. So in rural areas where there is a proven need for social housing, as evidenced in the housing executive's waiting list, we as a housing association can seek approval to expand the number of homes we can offer those in housing need, either through the purchase of new properties or by building new build properties. But if the housing executive's waiting list does not indicate there is a need for additional social housing in smaller rural communities, it means that we would not get approval to develop additional social housing in those communities. So therefore, it's really important that we as a housing association are proactive in trying to identify if there is hidden need for social housing in some of the smaller rural communities by encouraging people that are in housing need to come forward and register for housing in that rural community. And by proving need and increasing the number of people on the waiting list for rural communities, we can then seek approval to develop that much needed housing in those smaller rural areas. So one of the ways that we prove need as a way of addressing rural homelessness and the need for social housing in rural communities is by working with the housing executive to conduct what's known as rural housing needs tests, and have provided a quick overview of what a rural housing needs test looks like. So as part of a rural housing needs test, we will carry out extensive work with rural communities. So we'll generally involve local community groups, local councillors and politicians, churches, schools, etc., to try and promote the rural housing needs test as widely as possible, because these are the organisations and individuals that know their community best and that are aware of people that are in housing need. And we ask these organisations to encourage people who are in housing need to come forward and to put their name down on the housing executive's waiting list for a home in that rural community. By increasing the number of people on the waiting list in rural areas, we can then prove to government bodies that there's a need for more social housing in that area. And once we've demonstrated the need and identified a suitable site, we can then seek approval to bring more housing to that rural community for those that are homeless or in housing stress. And I wanted to give you a real example of the difference that a rural housing needs test can make in addressing homelessness and housing need in rural areas. So one of our latest schemes, one of our latest social housing schemes, is based on Rathlin Island in Northern Ireland. So Rathlin Island is Northern Ireland's only inhabited offshore island. It has a very small population of 150 people. So before we conducted a rural housing needs test on the island, the housing executive's waiting list indicated that there was no need for additional social housing on Rathlin and that there was no housing need in the area. But feedback from the local community and local politicians that were working on the island suggested that there may be a hidden need for housing on the island that hadn't been identified through the housing waiting list. So in order for us as a housing association to get approval to proceed with the development of additional social housing on the island, we first needed to prove that there were people who were homeless or in housing need on Rathlin. And to do this, we worked alongside the housing executive and other statutory and community agencies that were already working on the island to encourage people who were homeless or in housing stress to come forward and register their need for housing on the island. And without identifying that hidden need for additional housing, we wouldn't have been able to proceed with our 10-unit scheme. And the results of the demand tested indicate that there was an additional need for 10 social housing properties. So that's an example of why we need to be proactive and work with rural communities to try and identify the true housing need in rural communities. And without that proper community engagement, the myth that homelessness in rural communities is not an issue will continue to persist. And this will inevitably drive those that are homeless or in housing stress to leave rural communities to access accommodation elsewhere in your larger urban towns and centres. So security of tenure is also a really important aspect of addressing rural homelessness. So all too often, temporary accommodation or the private rented sector can't provide that permanent, secure accommodation for those that have been previously affected by homelessness. And temporary accommodation is a really important part of the process of addressing homelessness, but it's also very important to find permanent, secure housing solutions for those that are in housing need. So housing associations like ourselves and the housing executive can offer lower rent levels through social housing properties than the likes of the private sector. And we can also offer more secure housing than the private sector. And that's really important for people that have experienced homelessness. We can also adapt our properties to meet the health needs of our tenants, meaning that they can remain at home even if their health needs change in the future. So all our new build properties would be future-proofed, ensuring that each of our homes can be easily adapted if the health needs of our tenants change. So for example, we can easily adapt downstairs bathrooms to wet rooms and install stair lifts, etc. And they're all really important steps in making sure that our homes can be a lifelong place to live for our tenants that have previously come from homeless backgrounds. So whilst the provision of social housing is one of the main ways to address homelessness in the long term, another key factor in preventing homelessness in rural areas is to help tenants in social housing properties sustain their tenancies. So within Rural Housing Association, we would work very closely with all our tenants to make sure that they can sustain their tenancies. And we do this by identifying those tenants that are most at risk of falling into financial difficulties or losing their tenancies due to other life crisis. So within rural housing association, our tenancy sustainment strategy would focus on making sure that we're maintaining regular contact with all our tenants, but in particular those tenants that are most at risk of issues which may affect their ability to stay within their home. And that regular contact is really important for our most vulnerable tenants because we can ascertain what other types of support networks are required to help tenants remain in their home. And that's a really important multi-agency approach to supporting tenants. So we have a dedicated staff team that have a responsibility to set up individual support plans, particularly for our most vulnerable tenants. And they would work very closely with external agencies to make sure that there's support mechanisms in place that can help our service users stay in their homes for the long term. So alongside that, we would also run support projects for our tenants, including emergency food delivery services for those that are struggling to access meals, and that's become particularly important during the pandemic. We also run positive mental health projects, resilience projects in rural communities, and they're all important steps in supporting our most vulnerable tenants to remain at home. But in summary, I wanted to just address some of the main issues in terms of addressing rural homelessness. So we need to have structures in place that help organisations work collaboratively. It's not about one organisation having the solution to addressing homelessness. So whether that be in the implementation of rural housing needs tests, which identify hidden need for social housing in rural communities by working with local community groups, churches, schools and councillors, or whether it be the multi-agency approach to supporting those that are living in social housing properties and that have transitioned from homelessness into permanent secure housing and how they can sustain their tenancies. We also need to address the stigma that is associated with homelessness that prevents many people from coming forward to seek help and support, particularly in rural communities. And we need to ensure that the referral process feels safe and confidential for those people in rural areas that are coming forward to access housing support. We also need to increase support services in rural locations for those people that are at risk of homelessness and ensure that people that are living in rural communities know where they can go to access advice and assistance, particularly at locations that are convenient and suitable for them, because not all rural residents have access to their own transport or to public transport. And pre-crisis intervention work is really important in helping prevent homelessness in the first place. So generally, you would find that homelessness is the result of a long line of issues that have impacted an individual or a family. So it's generally not the first crisis that an individual or family have faced. And if we can provide that person-centered service that's tailored to the needs of those individuals who find themselves at risk of homelessness, and then put in place a multi-agency support plan for those individuals, we can prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. We also need to make sure that we have the support mechanisms in place to help people sustain their tenancies once they're accommodated in social housing or housing executive homes. And again, that's about that multi-agency individualised support programmes. But finally, we really need to increase the number of social housing properties that are available across Northern Ireland, particularly in rural communities, so that people that are homeless or that are in housing stress do have access to safe and secure homes. So I'm going to end today's presentation with a short video from some of our tenants who are living in some of our properties and the impact that a secure and safe home can have on an individual's life.